She was 21 and homeless. No family who would take her in, no savings, just a canvas oilskin bag, and $10 she had earned culling crabs at a dock in Cambridge. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned oyster house on a tidal creek on the eastern shore of Maryland, in a stretch of Dorchester County that had not seen a working shucking room since the house had closed in 1967. The cedar shake siding had gone silver with the salt. The dock pilings had rotted to the waterline. The county had been trying to give the building away since 2010. But what nobody knew was that hidden beneath the shucking room floor of that old oyster house, in a stone-lined well that hadn't been opened in over 55 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Bryn Oaks had grown up on the water the way certain Eastern Shore children grow up on the water, not as recreation, not as scenery, but as the floor of the house. The Chesapeake Bay was the floor, and the tidal creeks that fed into it were the hallways, and the shallow oyster bars that lay beneath the brown-green surface of the tributaries were the rooms where the work was done. Her grandmother had taught her to think of the water this way. Her grandmother had been the person who had made the Chesapeake legible. Her grandmother's name was Pearline Oaks, and she had been an oyster tonger on the Chesapeake Bay for 38 years. Pearline had been born in 1934 in a small clapboard house on the Choptank River outside Cambridge, Maryland, the daughter of a black waterman named Cyrus Oaks, who had tonged oysters from a 20-foot wooden skiff from 1920 until his death in 1963. Cyrus had been the son of a freedman, a waterman named Solomon Oaks, who had tonged the same river from 1870 until 1919, from a boat he had built with his own hands. The Oaks family had worked the Chesapeake for 4 generations. They had worked it from small wooden boats with hand tongs, the long-handled iron rakes used to scrape oysters off the bottom, one tongsful at a time, in the cold months from October through March. Pearline had started tonging at 14, working beside Cyrus on his skiff. She had been the only girl on the river. By 18, she could work a pair of 20-foot shaft tongs in 12 feet of water, reading the texture of the oyster bar through the handles the way a blind person reads a page. She could tell by the vibration in the wooden shafts whether she was scraping live oysters or dead shell, whether the bottom was hard sand or soft mud, whether the bar was thick or thinning. Cyrus had died in 1963. Pearline had taken over his skiff, a wooden deadrise named the Solomon, and had tonged alone for 35 years until her back gave out in 2001. 35 years of standing in a wooden skiff on the Choptank in the cold and the wind, working the tongs down and pulling them up, each tongsful bringing maybe a dozen oysters, each dozen going into the bushel basket, each basket worth whatever the buyer was paying, sometimes $30, sometimes $12. Pearline had also known how to shuck, not the tourist shucking, the quick rough pop and slide that oystermen's bars demonstrated for visitors, but the real shucking, the kind that took years to learn, the kind where the knife entered the oyster at exactly the right point on the hinge and the blade slid along the inside of the top shell without cutting the meat, and the shell opened in a single, clean motion, and the oyster lay in its bottom shell, untouched, unmarked, with the liquor, the salt water the oyster held inside, still pooled around it. A properly shucked oyster looked like it had opened itself. An improperly shucked oyster looked like it had been attacked. Pearline had learned to shuck from the women at Spicer's Oyster House, not from Harlan Spicer himself, who had been the boss and the buyer, but from the black women from Cambridge who stood at the shucking bench all day. Women who had been shucking Chesapeake oysters since they were 12 and 13, and whose hands moved with a speed that made the work look effortless, which it was not. The fastest shucker had been a woman named Cora May Willis, who could do a bushel in 32 minutes. A pace so fast the other women had stopped counting and had simply watched her hands, the knife entering and turning, and the shell opening and the oyster sliding into the pint cup without a wasted motion. Pearline had told Bryn about Cora May not as nostalgia, but as lineage. Cora May taught me the wrist rotation, Pearline told Bryn once when Bryn was 10. The rotation is the whole secret. You don't push the knife, you turn it. Your wrist does a small half circle at the hinge like turning a key in a lock, and the shell pops. Push, and you cut the meat. Turn, and you don't. Cora May could turn so fast you couldn't see the motion. You just heard the pop, and the shell was open. I watched her for 4 years before I could do it at half her speed. She never slowed down to teach me. She just let me watch. Watching was the teaching. Pearline had shucked properly for 38 years, and she had taught Bryn to shuck properly from the time Bryn was 7. Sitting at the wooden shucking bench in Pearline's kitchen, working through a pile of oysters Pearline had tonged that morning, each one a small lesson in where the knife goes and how much pressure and what angle and when to stop pushing and let the shell do the rest. Pearline had married a man named Otis Oakes, a distant cousin, a crabber who had worked the trot lines on the chop tank for 40 years and who had understood, in the specific way that a waterman married to a waterman understands things, that his wife's work on the water was not a hobby or a phase but was the central fact of her life, the way the water itself was the central fact of the eastern shore. Otis had not tonged. Otis had crabbed. The two trades had complementary seasons, crabs in the summer, oysters in the winter, and the marriage had been organized around the water's calendar, the way marriages on the eastern shore had been organized for 300 years. Otis had died in 1999. Pearline had continued alone for 2 more years before her back had ended it. Pearline and Otis had had one daughter, a woman named Lorraine, who was Bryn's mother. Lorraine had left the eastern shore at 19. She had moved to Baltimore, had worked as a home health aide, had had Bryn with a man who had left before Bryn was born, and had died of a stroke at the age of 33 when Bryn was 5. Bryn had been sent to the eastern shore to live with Pearline. The arrangement had not been discussed or negotiated. It had simply happened, the way water fills the space available to it. Lorraine had died on a Tuesday. Bryn had been on the eastern shore by Friday. Pearline had raised Bryn in the small clapboard house on the chop tank from the time Bryn was 5 until Pearline's death when Bryn was 16. 11 years. Those 11 years had been the years in which Bryn had learned the water. Pearline had taken Bryn out on the Solomon from her first autumn on the eastern shore. Bryn had been 5, and the skiff had been a 20-foot wooden dead-rise with a small outboard engine and a flat working deck and 2 sets of patent tongs racked along the gunwales, and the chop tank river had been wide and brown-green and cold in the October morning light. Pearline had motored out to a bar she knew, a bar Cyrus had worked, a bar Solomon had worked before Cyrus, and she had set the tongs and had worked them down and pulled them up, and the oysters had come up in the iron rakes, dark and rough and dripping, and Bryn had watched from the bow seat with the specific wide-eyed attention of a 5-year-old who has just been placed on the surface of a world she did not know existed. "Watch the water," Pearline told her. "The color tells you what's on the bottom. Dark green means deep channel, no oysters there. Brown-green means shallow bar, oysters maybe. Gray-green means shell bottom. Oysters used to be there, might be coming back. You learn the colors, you learn the bottom. You learn the bottom, you learn where the oysters are." Bryn had learned the colors. She had learned them by repetition, by attention, by the specific patience of a child who has been placed beside a grandparent who is doing the most important work of her life, and who is willing to explain it one layer at a time. Pearline had also taught Bryn the names of the bars. Not the chart names, but the family names Cyrus and Solomon had used. Hambone Bar, where the oysters grew long and narrow. Preacher's Reef, where the current was tricky and the oysters were fat. Dead Man's Lumps, 3 small bars that looked like one on the chart but were separated by channels of deep mud. Bryn had memorized 14 bar names by the time she was 10, as a devotion, as a discipline, as a keeping. By the time Bryn was 8, she could read the river by color from the bow of the Solomon and tell Pearline, without looking at the depth finder, whether they were over a producing bar or over dead bottom. By 10, Pearline had let her handle the tongs, not the full 20-foot shaft tongs, which were too heavy for a 10-year-old, but a smaller set of hand tongs, about 8 feet long, that Pearline had made for her by a blacksmith in Easton named Mr. Colley, who had looked at the small girl standing in his shop and had said, "She's going to tong." And Pearline had said, "She's already tonging. She just needs shorter handles." Mr. Colley had made the tongs. He had not charged Pearline. He had said, "Cyrus Oakes's great-granddaughter is going to tong the chop tank. That's payment enough." By 12, Bryn could work the hand tongs in 6 feet of water and bring up a clean tongsful. Oysters separated from shell, mud shaken loose, the iron rakes coming up with nothing but live oysters ready for the bushel basket. By 14, she could shuck a bushel in under 40 minutes, the Eastern Shore standard for a professional shucker, working the knife into the hinge with the specific wrist rotation Pearline had taught her, the motion so practiced that it had become a kind of breathing. Each oyster opening in rhythm, the sound of the shucking a steady click and slide that Pearline said was the sound of the Oakes family going back 130 years. Pearline had also taught Bryn about the old Oyster house. 3 miles downstream from the clapboard house, on a tidal creek called Gales Creek, stood an abandoned oyster house, a cedar shake building on pilings over the water, with a shucking room, a packing room, and a small dock. The oyster house had been built in 1901 by a white oysterman named Harlan Spicer, who had operated it as a shucking and packing house for the watermen of the chop tank until 1967, when the oyster harvest had declined to the point that the house could no longer pay for itself. Pearline had shucked in that house. From 1963 until it closed in 1967, she had brought her catch to Spicer's dock every afternoon and had shucked her own oysters in the shucking room alongside Spicer's regular shuckers, all of them black women from Cambridge who stood at the long wooden bench and shucked by the gallon for 12 cents a pint. Harlan Spicer paid by the pint, Pearline told Bryn once on a winter evening when Bryn was 11. 12 cents. The women who shucked for Spicer could do 20 pints an hour. That's $2.40 an hour. The minimum wage in 1965 was $1.25. The shuckers made almost twice minimum wage, but they made it by standing on their feet for 8 hours in a room that smelled like brine and shell, and they went home with cuts on every finger. Your great-aunt Doris shucked in that room for 14 years. She had scars on both hands that looked like a map of the chop tank. Pearline had died when Bryn was 16. A quiet death in the clapboard house on a Sunday morning in January. Oyster season, the only season that would have been right. Bryn had been in the kitchen making coffee. She had heard a sound from the bedroom. Not a loud sound, just a small exhalation. The kind of sound a person makes when they set something heavy down for the last time. And she had walked to the bedroom door and had known before she opened it. After Pearline's death, Bryn had gone to live with her mother's sister, Pearline's other daughter, a woman named Thelma, who lived in a small rental house in Cambridge. Thelma had been kind. Thelma had been steady. Thelma had worked at the crab-picking plant in Cambridge for 22 years and had raised 2 children of her own, and had taken Bryn in without discussion because Thelma had understood, the way Chesapeake women have understood for 300 years, that when a child loses everyone on the water, the family on the shore takes over. Bryn had finished high school in Cambridge. She had not gone to college. She had gotten a job at a crab dock in Cambridge, culling and grading blue crabs for $13 an hour, working the summer season from May through October. In the off-season, she had done whatever work she could find, cleaning vacation rentals, stocking shelves at the Dollar General, helping Thelma at the picking plant when they needed extra hands. In the winters, when the oyster season was open, Bryn had borrowed Wardell Phelps's skiff and gone out on the river alone. Not to tong. She had no commercial license. She went to watch. She motored to Pearline's bars and sat in the skiff and read the colors and felt the river through the hull. She was keeping the language alive in her body so that when the time came it would still be there. Wardell had understood. He loaned her his skiff every winter Saturday without asking what she was doing, because a waterman's granddaughter on the river alone in January is keeping a promise to the dead. She had lived with Thelma for 4 years. The arrangement had ended in March of Bryn's 21st year when Thelma had married a man named Darnell, a truck driver from Salisbury who had been decent enough but who had made it clear, without saying it directly, that a grown niece in the spare bedroom was not part of his picture of married life. Thelma had been apologetic. "He's not a bad man, Bryn," Thelma said. "He just wants his own house." "I understand that. I'm sorry." Bryn had understood. She had packed her oilskin bag and the hand tongs Mr. Colley had made for her and Perline's shucking knife, a hand-forged carbon steel blade with a wooden handle that Perline had used for 38 years, and that she had given to Bryn on Bryn's 14th birthday with the instruction that a shucking knife was not to be loaned, displayed or put in a drawer, but was to be used every day because a knife that sits in a drawer loses its edge and its purpose simultaneously. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been taught a skill so specific that only the person who taught you would know whether you were doing it right? She had $440 in savings and no car. She had Perline's shucking knife in the oilskin bag. She was standing at the crab dock in Cambridge the following Monday morning, waiting to start her shift, when the dock owner, a man named Wardell Phelps, a 63-year-old crabber who had known Perline for 40 years, said to her, without preamble, "Your grandmother used to shuck at the old Spicer house on Gales Creek. You know the building?" Bryn said, "I know it." "County's been trying to unload it since 2010, Wardell said. "Nobody wants it. Too far off the road, pilings half rotted, no electric, no water. They're asking $10. He looked at her. "I'm telling you because Perline would have wanted you to know." Bryn walked to the Dorchester County Clerk's office in Cambridge that afternoon. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Travers, stamped the deed and handed Bryn a heavy iron key. "The shucking room is on the water side," Mrs. Travers said. "The floor is original. Harlan Spicer laid it himself in 1901. Be careful. Oyster house floors get slick." She borrowed Wardell's skiff and motored down the chop tank to Gales Creek that evening. The oyster house stood on its pilings at the edge of the creek, silver cedar shake, the dock pilings rotted to stubs, the shucking room door hanging from one hinge. She tied the skiff to a remaining piling and climbed up. The shucking room was long and narrow, maybe 30 feet by 12, plank floor, open to the creek on the water side through a row of wooden shutters that folded up to let in the air. The long wooden shucking bench ran the full length of the room, with iron brackets where the shuckers had clamped their stations. The packing room was behind it, smaller, cooler, with a concrete floor and drain. Everything smelled of brine and old shell. In the shucking room, near the center of the plank floor, one board was different from the others. It was wider, and it had been cut shorter than the boards on either side, and the ends had been fitted with small brass plates, the kind of hardware a boat builder would use, not a house builder. Bryn knelt. She worked Perline's shucking knife under the edge of the board. It lifted. Beneath the board, set into the pilings and the framing, was a small, stone-lined well, maybe 12 inches square and 18 inches deep, the stone dry and tight despite being over water, the kind of stonework a waterman would do if he understood that a dry cavity in a wet building required careful masonry. Inside the well, wrapped in oilcloth, were a leather tool roll, a heavy canvas pouch, and a folded letter. The tool roll held 3 shucking knives, each one hand-forged, each one a different shape. The first was short and thick-bladed, built for the hard-shelled wild Chesapeake oyster. The second was longer and thinner, built for the cultivated oyster with its more regular shell. The third was narrow and curved, built for the Chincoteague salt oyster with its deep cup and tight hinge. Each handle was carved with the initials H.S., Harlan Spicer. 3 knives for 3 oysters. The full set. The canvas pouch held gold coins, 37 Liberty Half Eagles, dated between 1901 and 1966. The coin dealer in Easton valued them at approximately $19,000. She opened the letter. "To whoever opens this floor. My name is Harlan Spicer. I have run this oyster house from 1901 until today, March 9th, 1967. The bars that my father worked are dead and the harvest is down to nothing. I'm leaving my knives and my savings in this floor because the floor is the driest place in a building built over water. The 3 knives are for 3 oysters. A man who owns all 3 knows the Chesapeake. The chart shows every bar I have worked in 66 years. Most are gone, but some will come back if the water cleans up and the spat takes hold. A bar that dies is not always dead. Sometimes it is resting. Watch the water." Harlan Spicer, Oysterman, March 9th, 1967. Bryn read the letter twice. Then she took Perline's shucking knife from the oilskin bag and walked out of the shucking room onto the remaining dock pilings and looked down at Gales Creek. The tide was coming in. The water was brown-green. Shallow bar, oysters maybe. She reached into the water and pulled a single oyster off the closest piling. She worked Perline's knife into the hinge and opened it with one clean motion. The oyster lay in its shell, untouched. The liquor pooled around it. She tasted it. Salt and copper and cold creek water and the specific mineral tang of the chop tank bottom. She stood on the pilings with the empty shell in her hand and the taste of the creek on her tongue and did not cry and did not speak. She simply tasted. The taste was Perline's kitchen and Cyrus's river and Solomon's boat and 130 years of the Oaks family working this water. She said quietly to the creek and to the oyster house and to the shucking room behind her, "Thank you, Mr. Spicer. I will watch the water." The next morning, she took Wardell's skiff back to Cambridge and deposited the coin dealer's check at the bank on Race Street. She opened a checking account and a savings account and walked out into the March wind. The following week, she bought a used truck, a 2004 Ford Ranger with 156,000 miles and a rusted-out tailgate, from a retired waterman in Church Creek for $1,900. It ran. She also bought from the same man a 17-foot fiberglass skiff with a 25-horse outboard for $2,200. It floated. The first month was the shucking room floor. The plank floor had rotted in 3 sections where the creek water had come up through the pilings during storm tides, and the rot had to be cut out and new planking laid before the room could hold weight. She bought pressure-treated lumber from a yard in Cambridge for $380 and laid the new planks herself across 2 weeks, working on her hands and knees over the water, the smell of brine and creosote mixing in the warm April air. Wardell came out on a Saturday in his own skiff and sat on the dock and drank coffee and watched her work and said, "Perline laid that floor the same way, on her knees. She said it was the only way to know if the boards were level. You had to feel it with your kneecaps." Bryn said, "She told me the same thing." Wardell said, "Of course she did." She converted the packing room into a living space in pieces across the first month, the way a person furnishes a room over water when every dollar has a name and nothing can be wasted. The first week she slept in a sleeping bag on the concrete floor of the packing room, with her oilskin bag as a pillow and the sound of the tide coming in through the pilings beneath her. It was a sound she knew, the slow, rhythmic creak of a building settling with the current, the small slap of water against wood, the distant call of an osprey on the creek at dawn. Perline's house on the chop tank had made these sounds. The oyster house made them louder because the oyster house was built over the water rather than beside it, and the water was directly beneath the floor, 6 feet down, rising and falling twice a day with the tide. The second week, she bought a folding army cot from the thrift store in Cambridge for $20 and set it against the back wall of the packing room, away from the drain. Wardell brought her a camp stove from his shed and a kerosene lantern that had belonged to his wife, who had died 3 years earlier. "Nadine used that lantern when we crabbed at night," Wardell said. "She'd want it in a working building." He also brought a tin coffee pot and a cast-iron Dutch oven and set them on the concrete floor beside the camp stove without comment. He came back the following Saturday with a 5-gallon water jug and a plastic tub for washing. He came back every Saturday after that. He never announced he was coming. He simply appeared on the creek in his skiff around 9 in the morning, tied up at the dock, walked into the shucking room, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Ada had brewing, and sat on an overturned bushel basket and watched the creek. She hung Perline's shucking knife on a nail above the cot. The hand-forged carbon steel blade Perline had used for 38 years, the wooden handle worn smooth by 10,000 bushels. She stood the hand tongs Mr. Colley had made for her in the corner beside the door, where she could see them from the cot. She set Spicer's 3 knives in their leather roll on the shucking bench in the main room, displayed open so the 3 different blade shapes were visible. She kept the shucking room as she had found it. The long bench, the iron station brackets where Cora May Willis and the other women had stood, the wooden shutters that folded up to let in the creek air. The bench was worn smooth by decades of oysters sliding across its surface, and the wood had a pale bleached quality, sanded by salt and shell, that no amount of refinishing could replicate. She did not refinish it. She wiped it down with creek water and let it dry in the sun. The first night she slept with the shutters open, a warm April night, the tide high, the creek lapping against the pilings beneath the floor. She lay on the cot and listened to the building breathe. Because an oyster house over water does breathe. The pilings creak with the current. The floor shifts a 1/4 inch with the tide. The cedar shakes expand in the humid night air and contract in the cool morning. The building moves the way a boat moves, not dramatically, not dangerously, but perceptibly. A gentle, constant motion that tells the person sleeping inside that the water is there, that the water is alive, that the building and the water are in conversation. Perline would have understood. Perline had spent 35 years standing in a boat on this river. Sleeping in a building over this river was the next closest thing. She got a job in her 2nd year. A small oyster aquaculture operation in the chop tank, one of the new restoration farms that were raising spat on shell and planting them on the depleted bars. Hired her as a part-time oyster tender and shucking instructor, because the owner, a marine biologist named Dr. Anita Foskey, had heard from Wardell that there was a young woman at the old Spicer house who could read the bottom by the color of the water and shuck a bushel in under 40 minutes. Dr. Foskey had driven out to Gales Creek in a university truck and had watched Bryn shuck a dozen oysters and had said, "Where did you learn that wrist rotation?" Bryn said, "My grandmother." Dr. Foskey said, "I've been studying oyster harvest techniques for 15 years and I've never seen that rotation in a textbook. It's not taught. It's handed down." She hired Bryn on the spot, but the shucking work came on its own too. Word had spread along the docks in Cambridge that a young woman at the old Spicer house was tonging oysters from Gales Creek and selling them shucked to order from the dock. A restaurant owner in St. Michael's drove an hour to buy 2 gallons of shucked chop tank oysters after a waterman at the Cambridge dock told him, "She shucks clean, no grit, no shell, liquor intact." Her grandmother was Perline Oakes. The name had been enough. 3 more restaurants called within the month. Thelma visited in the autumn with Darnell. Darnell stood in the shucking room and looked at the long bench and the iron brackets and Spicer's 3 knives on the wall, and said nothing for a long time and then said, "I didn't know this was here." Thelma said, "Nobody did." Bryn handed Darnell an oyster she had just shucked from the creek, opened clean, liquor intact, lying in its shell, and he ate it standing in the shucking room and said, "That's the best oyster I've ever tasted." Bryn said, "That's the chop tank." It was the right thing to say because it gave the credit to the river and not to herself, which is what Pearline would have done. On a clear evening, in late October of her 24th year, Bryn sat on the edge of the dock she had rebuilt, new pilings, new decking, Wardell's skiff tied alongside her own, and watched the last copper light fade across Gales Creek. The tide was going out. The water was turning the specific gray-green that meant shell bottom. Oysters used to be there, might be coming back. 3 miles upstream, the aquaculture farms spat on shell plantings were taking hold on bars that had been dead for 30 years. The bars were not dead. The bars were resting. She thought about Pearline, who had stood in a wooden skiff on the chop tank for 35 years, working 20-foot tongs in the cold and the wind, and who had read the bottom through the vibration in the wooden handles. She thought about Cyrus, who had tonged the same river from the same kind of boat, and about Solomon, who had built his first boat in 1870 with the specific determination of a freed man who had decided that the water was going to be his, and that no one was going to take it from him. She thought about Harlan Spicer, who had laid a stone-lined well in the floor of his own shucking room and had sealed 3 knives and a lifetime of savings in it because the floor was the driest place in a building built over water. That's the thing about the water our grandmothers teach us to read. We do not always know, when we are 5 years old and sitting in the bow of a wooden skiff watching the surface of a river change color, that the reading is itself the trade. We only know that an old woman is standing at the stern with tongs in her hands and that the water below us is brown-green and that she is pulling dark, rough shapes from the bottom. We learn it slowly, season by season, bar by bar, across a childhood measured in bushels, and the steady click and slide of a shucking knife at the end of a winter afternoon. And then, 5 years after the old woman dies, we kneel on the floor of a shucking room she worked in and lift a board, and find 3 knives in a well sealed 60 years ago. And we understand what our grandmother had been teaching us. She had been teaching us to read what is beneath the surface. The oyster is beneath the water. The bar is beneath the oyster. The knife is beneath the floor. And the trade is the willingness to reach down into the dark and bring up what is there. Bryn Oakes was 21 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned oyster house on a tidal creek on the eastern shore of Maryland. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories, never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full Quiet Road story, just like this one. There is also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next Quiet Road.